What can I do for you today?
We're hoping you can talk some sense into ID Pruitt.
Ain't too many people ever had much success doing that.
We'd like you to try.
And what would the reason be?
His self-preservation. He needs to stop shooting up my clubs.
Clubs? What kind of clubs? Bridge clubs? 'Cause I belong to the Greater Tampa Rotary Club myself, and I don't recall ever seeing you.
I come here to do a piece of business with you. You want to play fucking games?
Is that what I want to do?
Look, you're the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan around here. Congratulations. But do you think that we got where we are by letting some inbred shitpickers muscle us?
If that's who you think we are, you're making a fatal miscalculation, son. 'Cause we're clerks and bankers and police officers and deputies and hell, we even got a judge. And if you're dumb enough to fight us, we're gonna rain bloody hellfire down on you and all you love.
So you're threatening me with people who are more powerful than you?
Exactly.
What the fuck am I talking to you for?
The Second World War left much of Europe, Britain, and the wider world in utter devastation. Global shipping routes were in disarray, and economies were shattered. Victory had been claimed in Europe, and with the catastrophic atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Pacific War came to an explosive end. Yet despite the victory, the aftermath was nothing short of chaos. Empires once mighty now lay in ruin, and their broken remnants needed rebuilding. Nations stood economically devastated, while the men who had fought were left physically and mentally shattered, struggling to rebuild their lives. Once wealthy elites now found themselves in financial ruins, desperate to restore their fortunes. Countries sought investment and reconstruction as a new battle loomed, this time for the hearts and minds of the people. Churchill, ever the bulldog, wanted Allied troops to march straight to Moscow, aiming to crush the Soviets before they could rise. However, Franklin D. Roosevelt, in his final days, quashed such ambitions. What remained was a divided Europe, teetering on the edge of a new conflict. Churchill's dream of defeating Russia was shelved, but only for a moment, as a new, ideological war was already brewing. The war on communism, the war on socialism. The seeds of this war were sown in Europe. Churchill himself was ousted in a shocking post-war election, replaced by a socialist government, a seismic event that sent shockwaves through the capitalist West. The ruling elites feared nothing more than the spread of socialism, especially governments sympathetic to the Soviet Union. The United States, sensing the power vacuum left by the crumbling European empires, stepped in to take charge. It was America, now ascendant, that would face off against the Soviet Union, thus igniting the Cold War. A conflict that would topple empires, create new ones, and pull in even the underworld of organized crime, including the Mafia, into its tangled web. In the post-World War II era, organized crime expanded its political influence, driven by mobsters' desire for legitimacy. As part of this effort, they eagerly exploited the rising anti-communist sentiment, using it to deflect attention away from their activities. The Mafia and its political allies weaponized the Red Scare, positioning themselves as staunch defenders of American democracy, while simultaneously ensuring their criminal operations remained untouched. This strategy allowed them to manipulate public fear of communism and shield themselves from scrutiny by law enforcement, journalists, and political rivals. Key to this manipulation was the support of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. Hoover, who had long been amassing files on suspected radicals since the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, was less focused on organized crime and more invested in hunting down communists. This was no accident. The Mafia benefited from Hoover's obsession with anti-communism, ensuring that the FBI's attention was diverted from their criminal enterprises. Hoover's FBI, blinded by a fervent anti-communist agenda, indirectly aided the Mafia by not prioritizing investigations into organized crime during the height of the Red Scare. The Mafia's influence on American politics and society surged, cleverly hiding behind the smokescreen of anti-communism. The rise of the Red Scare wasn't just about the fear of Soviet influence, but a carefully orchestrated campaign by organized crime to distract the American public. Mobsters, fearing investigation by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, capitalized on Cold War paranoia. Hoover, more interested in rooting out communism than tackling organized crime, essentially gave the Mafia free rein while they infiltrated Hollywood, labor unions, and even national politics. Hollywood played a critical role in this Mafia-driven distraction. Key players like John Rosselli, a mobster with deep connections to Hollywood studios, used their power to label certain labor unions as communist sympathizers. Rosselli, working with figures like Columbia Pictures owner Harry Cohn and Hollywood reporter-publisher Billy Wilkerson, spearheaded smear campaigns that led to the infamous Hollywood blacklist. The Mafia's influence in Hollywood wasn't limited to labor disputes. Rosselli, along with Meyer Lansky, partnered with Bugsy Siegel to build the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, further blending entertainment, organized crime, and politics. At the same time that the Red Scare gripped the nation, the key Hoover hearings, designed to expose organized crime, were underway. Yet the Mafia skillfully used anti-communist rhetoric to deflect attention from their illicit operations. Politicians like Richard Nixon and Nevada Senator Pat McCarran, supported by the mob, fanned the flames of McCarthyism, ensuring that the public remained fixated on the threat of communism, while the Mafia's grip on the country strengthened. Meyer Lansky and his associates, including Sam Jenness, were key players in this nexus of organized crime, real estate, and politics. Jenness, a notorious associate of Lansky, controlled Store Properties Inc., a real estate empire that amassed over $200 million worth of property across the United States. Jenness's business partner, Paul Zifrin, a prominent Democratic fundraiser, was later exposed as a front for the Chicago outfit. The scope of their financial influence extended beyond just property. It was about exerting control over industries like Hollywood while gaining political leverage in Washington. RKO Pictures, owned by wealthy investor Floyd Odlum, and powerful Hollywood figures like Samuel Goldwyn, Walt Disney, and Jack Warner, were key backers of the California Committee, a group that used anti-communism to push for a massive military build-up. This committee, cloaked in patriotism, was actually a front for Mafia influence, with figures like Lansky and Jenness quietly controlling the financial and political interest behind the scenes, making sure their criminal empire thrived while the public remained distracted by Cold War fears. The Teamsters Union was another critical part of this Mafia web. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters, which controlled deliveries to Hollywood studios, was heavily infiltrated by the mob. Joseph Schenck, chairman of 20th Century Fox, even hired Rosselli's Teamsters associate to oversee labor relations at the studio, ensuring that the Mafia's influence over labor disputes remained unchallenged. Despite convictions for extortion, Rosselli and his associates continued to operate with impunity, shielded by their political connections and the distraction of the Red Scare. The Mafia's exploitation of the Red Scare to obscure their control over politics, Hollywood, and labor unions was one of the most underappreciated power grabs in American history. By skillfully manipulating public fear of communism, the Mafia kept their criminal empire intact, infiltrating every level of society. The Red Scare was not just a Cold War phenomenon. It was the Mafia's golden opportunity to dominate American industry, politics, and public life, while the FBI and politicians, obsessed with rooting out communism, turned a blind eye to the real threat at home. Meyer Lansky, the so-called mob's accountant, had his fingerprints all over the complex interplay between organized crime, political corruption, and the fervent anti-communism that consumed post-war America. As Richard Nixon's political career took off, it was Lansky's world, the world of shadowy deals, covert influence, and the relentless pursuit of control that played a silent but unmistakable role behind the scenes. Even as Nixon worked with the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, which spearheaded the assault on communist infiltration, the echoes of organized crime and its ties to political power could be felt. The HUAC, particularly through Nixon's theatrics during the Alger Hiss case, was more than just a platform for battling communism. It became a stage for ambitious politicians, mob lawyers, and FBI insiders, all vying for influence. Nixon's ascendancy was not merely about Cold War paranoia. It was fueled by the dark symbiosis between politics and criminal underworlds. The involvement of key figures like Father John Cronin, whose secret pipeline to the FBI provided Nixon with confidential material, was significant. But it wasn't just about communist spies or the FBI's covert assistance. It was about the careful curation of public perception. And who better understand the manipulation of public opinion than someone steeped in the mob's tactics of quiet control? Lansky's vast criminal empire, which had ties to labor unions, gambling operations and bootlegging, had shown how easily money and influence could bend the will of even the most powerful institutions. Nixon, working with mob-connected political advisor Murray Chotiner, ran a brutal campaign against Helen Gahagan Douglas, branding her the Pink Lady. It was the underhanded tactics of Chotiner, a man with deep ties to the mob, which brought Nixon the Senate seat in 1950. The fingerprints of organized crime were all over this win, from the money that changed hands to the smear campaigns that echoed classic Mafia tactics. McCarthyism, led by Senator Joe McCarthy, was another chapter in this saga of collusion between crime, politics, and paranoia. McCarthy's relentless pursuit of supposed communists, backed by the FBI and influential anti-communist figures like Father Walsh, was fed by a network of dubious individuals with vested interests in distracting the public from their own shady dealings. Figures like Louis Rosenstiel, a former bootlegger turned liquor magnate, had close ties to both the mob and the FBI. His donations and influence, including his ties to Hoover's FBI, further blurred the lines between law enforcement, business, and organized crime. Rosenstiel's wife, Susan, later exposed the connections between her husband and some of the most powerful names in organized crime: Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and others. Susan sat quietly for a moment before beginning, her voice calm but carrying the weight of years of hidden truths. In the early 1950s, Hoover was a regular visitor at our home. My husband, Louis Rosenstiel, had ties with people like Meyer Lansky, a former bootlegger. I found out early in the marriage that my husband was bisexual, she said, her tone matter-of-fact. He was involved with Roy Cohn, the assistant counsel to Senator McCarthy. Roy used to come around with a little boyfriend and they'd squeeze each other. She hesitated briefly, as if still trying to process it after all these years. I should have seen it then, that he was a gay boy. One particular night stood out in Susan's memory. One day, Louis said, "We're going to the Plaza Hotel tonight, and Roy Cohn will be there." He told me, "You'll be very surprised at what you see." I didn't have much to say. I just said, "All right, I'll go." She adjusted her seat, as though reliving the tension from that evening. When we got to the plaza, Louis insisted we enter by a side door. We went up in the elevator to either the second or third floor. There was a sign on the door that said, "Do not disturb." We knocked, and Roy Cohn opened the door. We walked in, and that's when I saw him, a man sitting there dressed as a woman. Roy introduced him to me, saying, "I'd like you to meet Mary." Susan's voice lowered slightly, as if revealing a secret. But I knew it wasn't Mary. He looked just like J. Edgar Hoover. In fact, I'm sure it was Hoover. He was solid-looking, with a bit of growth on his face. He was dressed in a short black chiffon dress, with ruffles, black lace stockings, high heels, a black curly wig, and false eyelashes. He was sitting there, legs crossed. The journalist asked cautiously, "Wait a minute, you're saying it looked like J. Edgar Hoover? Or you're saying it was J. Edgar Hoover?" "It was clearly J. Edgar Hoover," Susan replied, with no hesitation in her voice. "Do I have any doubt about that? Absolutely not." Lansky's influence from Havana to Miami was a testament to how deeply entrenched the Mafia was in American political and economic life. The Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach, where mobsters gathered under the guise of legitimate business, was a physical symbol of the underworld's reach. In the shadowy corners of upscale hotels and renowned restaurants like Joe's Stone Crab, power players of a bygone era, men like Russell Bufalino, Carlo Gambino, Sam Giancana, Johnny Roselli, Carlos Marcello would rub shoulders with CIA agents, third-party contractors, Cuban exiles, and the enigmatic David Ferry. Jack Ruby, always lurking in the periphery, was another key player in these clandestine meetings, their ultimate aim, overthrowing Fidel Castro. Ferry, Marcello's personal pilot, and Ruby were often relegated to waiting outside while the big shots deliberated. Ferry and Marcello weren't strangers to each other either. In fact, Marcello and Santo Traficante Jr. were likely to have flown together to such meetings. Santo's eventual release from a Cuban prison was orchestrated by Marcello, with Ruby being the allocated bagman, proof of how deep their connections ran. As Castro tightened his grip on Cuba, the CIA and naval intelligence leaned heavily on organized crime. The Mafia, with its tendrils spreading from the US into Cuba, the Bahamas, South America and Brazil, had evolved into a powerful international syndicate. It was no longer just the American Mafia, it was a global network. This partnership, born during Lucky Luciano's imprisonment, laid the groundwork for the continued collaboration between naval intelligence, the CIA, and organized crime, shaping the geopolitical landscape as the world rapidly changed. As Nixon continued his political rise, figures like Louis Nichols, a former FBI insider, became crucial allies, using their law enforcement backgrounds to shield mob-tied individuals from scrutiny. Nichols' work with Rosenstiel, defending him against accusations of mob ties, was emblematic of the era. Corruption and organized crime weren't just tolerated, they were part of the system. And Nixon's reliance on these shadowy figures became even more evident as he navigated his career. Roy Cohn, perhaps the most notorious example of the union between anti-communism and the Mafia, worked closely with both McCarthy and Lansky's network. As McCarthy's legal counsel, Cohn's aggressive tactics mirrored those of the mobsters he would later represent. His association with mob figures like Anthony Fat Tony Salerno and Carmine Galante, alongside his connection to Lansky's sphere of influence, demonstrated how deeply intertwined politics and organized crime had become. It was no coincidence that Cohn, a lawyer for mobsters, also represented Nixon allies, further deepening the links between corruption, crime, and political ambition. Nixon's own entanglement with this world was unmistakable, from his connections to mob-linked lawyers like Cohn to his use of dirty tactics in his campaigns. Behind the anti-communist rhetoric and the Cold War fear-mongering, Lansky's shadow loomed large, representing the marriage of organized crime and political power that defined much of mid-20th century America. This web of corruption, secrecy, and manipulation, while hidden behind a veil of patriotism and anti-communism, was as much a product of Lansky's influence as it was of Nixon's ambitions. US criminals began targeting Caribbean nations for exploitation as early as the mid-19th century, following the surge of New York and Boston. Investors who were developing sugarcane and fruit plantations in the region. Alongside these legitimate business ventures, US organized crime syndicates moved in, establishing footholds in places like Guatemala and Honduras, through their control of the New Orleans docks. These crime groups forged connections with the burgeoning banana companies, infiltrating the drug trade and expanding their influence into gambling operations. In Mexico, they built a stronghold in gambling and narcotics, especially during the 1940s. In the 50s as well as the 60s, the New Orleans crime families, led by Carlos Marcello, played a key role in the Guatemala and Honduras operations. As Marcello anticipated the possibility of deportation, he sought out safe havens, with Guatemala emerging as a strong option. Cuba, once a potential refuge, was off the table due to Castro's control, but Guatemala, along with Honduras, presented promising alternatives. One of the most infamous cases of organized crime flourishing in the Caribbean came in Cuba, where under the protection of General Fulgencio Batista, North American mobsters like Meyer Lansky and Santo Traficante Sr. and later Jr. grew wealthy from controlling casino gambling, luxury hotels, and nightclubs. These activities continued until Fidel Castro's revolution ousted Batista and expelled the mobsters from the island. Long before the surge of interest in transnational crime during the 1990s, which saw criminal networks crossing borders and leveraging globalization to amass power, these criminal enterprises thrived by forming mutually beneficial relationships with governments. This history demonstrates that organized crime did not simply prey on weak states, but instead often developed reciprocal relationships with state institutions, public officials, and politicians. North American mobsters often bought protection from politicians and law enforcement, a strategy they had refined back home. With suitcases of cash and favors, they secured gambling licenses and other lucrative concessions, ensuring their dominance in competition with rivals. In return for protection, these criminals offered their expertise in violence, bribery, and corruption, along with their understanding of local institutions. Intelligence agencies, like the CIA, sometimes saw value in enlisting these criminal networks for their own purposes. For instance, after World War II, the CIA recruited the Corsican Mafia to break the control of communist-influenced unions on the Marseille docks. Over the following decades, the agency armed opium traffickers in Southeast Asia and Afghanistan as part of broader efforts to combat communism, indirectly contributing to the rise of drug cartels in Latin America as a result of their support for the Nicaraguan Contras in the 1980s. Foreign governments have used similar tactics on U.S. soil. In 1976, the Chilean military junta hired a group of drug-trafficking neo-fascists to orchestrate the assassination of a prominent political exile in Washington, D.C., using the very methods, violence, bribery, and illicit ties to power that had long defined organized crime's influence both at home and abroad. For nearly 2 decades, Fulgencio Batista and Meyer Lansky shared an unspoken enigmatic alliance, quietly shaping the landscape of Cuban tourism and its underworld dealings. Their relationship was born from a simple but powerful gesture. A cash bribe delivered to Batista by Lansky and his associate, Doc Stacher. This gesture sparked a partnership that, despite years of political upheaval, global depression and war, refused to die. The original dream, a casino empire on the sun-soaked shores of Havana. And now, with the war over and pockets full once again, it was time for that dream to rise from the ashes. The mob's conference at the Hotel Nacional was a clarion call. American gangsters were ready to invest, and Batista was their key. For Lansky and Batista, their bond was almost supernatural. No photos, no signed documents, no overt meetings. Yet, they knew precisely what the other needed, working in sync to build their fortunes from the shadows. Together, they became the unseen architects of the Havana mob, enriching themselves through a partnership that flourished without them ever needing to stand side by side in public. Batista's early life couldn't have contrasted more with his later ascent. Raised in the shadow of United Fruit's dominance over Cuba, Batista grew up in Baines, a town practically built by the American conglomerate. His father, a cane cutter, endured brutal, exploitative work under the searing sun, and young Fulgencio had to abandon school by age 8 to help. It was a life defined by backbreaking labor, foreign control, and a lingering sense of inferiority towards the United States. An inferiority that would later push Batista to align himself with American corporations and mobsters like Lansky. While Lansky dreamed of being seen as a legitimate businessman, resenting how figures like Rockefeller or Joseph P. Kennedy were revered while he remained a shadowy figure, Batista harbored his own complex desires. Born of mixed-race heritage, his beauty was legendary, earning him the nickname El Mulato Lindo in his early days, though he despised its implications. Batista's androgynous good looks masked a steely resolve. Despite his appearance, he was no fragile figure. He joined the military, and with cunning, charisma, and a knack for knowing when to pull the right strings, he climbed to the top of Cuba's power structure. By his early 30s, Batista had emerged as the ultimate power broker, leading the Cuban military after the revolt of 1933. Though presidents came and went, they all danced to Batista's tune, and in 1940 he stepped into the presidency himself. Cuba remained a country caught between dictatorship and democracy, and Batista styled himself as a benevolent dictator, maintaining order through a blend of repression and bribery. His genius was in playing both sides, promoting education and social reform on one hand, while tolerating corruption and political violence on the other. Batista's connection with Lansky wasn't just financial, it was ideological. Both men saw opportunity where others saw chaos. They recognized that the post-war boom in tourism would create a goldmine for casinos, and Lansky needed Batista back in power to make it happen. While Batista spent time in quiet exile in Florida, he maintained his ambition. Lansky's Colonial Inn became a frequent haunt for Batista, where he cut a sharp figure in his white suits, quietly building his case for a political comeback. By the late 1940s, Batista was ready to return, announcing his intent to run for senator, a calculated first step back to the Cuban throne. His exile had been leisurely, but Lansky's influence and Cuba's emerging tourism potential pulled him back into the political spotlight. Both men understood that the stakes were higher than ever. They weren't just building casinos. They were building an empire, with themselves at the center of it all, poised to dominate the new Havana. Together, Batista and Lansky embodied the strange dance of power, money, and influence that defined mid-century Cuba. One man had risen from the sugarcane fields to the halls of power, while the other, born in the Lower East Side, transformed from a streetwise hustler into an empire builder. Their fates intertwined, their fortunes made, all behind the scenes, while Havana's glittering casinos and lavish hotels became the face of their silent pact. In the end, their story was one of ambition, corruption, and an underworld tango that helped shape the course of Cuban history. When Meyer Lansky and his wife Teddy tied the knot in Havana in December 1948, Fulgencio Batista had quietly been back in the political arena for several months. Though he had his eyes set on the presidency, Cuban law stood in his way. He couldn't run for the top office again until he'd first served a term in a lower position. So, Batista settled into his new role as senator for Las Villas, a rural province, while biding his time. His duties were minimal, giving him the space to lay low at Cuquina, his sprawling estate on the outskirts of Havana, and plot his eventual return to power. The goal was simple: reclaim the presidency, and with Lansky's help, finally transform Havana into the glittering Monte Carlo of the Caribbean. However, the years leading up to his presidential eligibility were anything but quiet. Cuba remained mired in its endless cycle of corruption, financial instability, and political violence. And now a new scourge had entered the scene: gangsterismo, or gangsterism. The 1940 Constitution had weakened the military's stranglehold on the country, and in the resulting power vacuum, political factions formed their own armed gangs. What had once been the sole domain of the military now devolved into chaos, with rival groups fighting for control. It was an era of random violence, paranoia, and assassinations. As Max Lesnick, a student leader and founding member of the Ortodoxo Party, recalled, "Violence became a common tool of the political process. The group with the most guns had the most influence. Political operatives, student activists, and union leaders armed themselves, sparking gang warfare across the island. President Carlos Prio attempted to stem the tide by paying gang leaders at the University of Havana to turn in their weapons. The plan backfired, leading to even more brazen gangster activity. As tensions rose, certain young men emerged from this storm as either feared criminals or budding political figures. Among them was a 22-year-old law student named Fidel Castro, who quickly made a name for himself, though not always for the right reasons. Castro's notoriety reached new heights in June 1948, when he was accused of murdering a police sergeant. The sergeant allegedly named Castro as his killer before succumbing to his wounds. But the witness who had supported the claim later recanted, admitting he had been bribed by police. Though the charges were dropped, Castro had already developed a reputation as a political firebrand, known for carrying a Browning pistol and engaging in violent confrontations with rival gangs. Despite his brash behavior, Castro was clearly a rising star, especially among Havana's student activists. He soon gravitated toward the Ortodoxo Party, approaching Max Lesnick with the ambition of joining its youth committee. When Lesnick told him that no member of the committee could carry a weapon, Castro replied, "I won't carry it anymore." He then took a public stand against the gangsterism that had plagued Cuban politics, delivering a fiery speech denouncing the corrupt pact between President Prio and the gangs. As his enemies gathered outside the university, Castro was whisked to safety by Lesnick, marking what Lesnick called Castro's first revolutionary act. Batista, always on the lookout for potential allies or threats, took note of Castro's rise. Through a family connection, he arranged a meeting with the young law student at his Cohn estate. The two men met in a room adorned with mementos of Batista's career, including a bust of Abraham Lincoln and a golden telephone gifted to him by IT&T. Accounts of the meeting vary. Some suggest Batista simply wanted to size Castro up, while others claim Castro offered to support Batista in a coup against President Prio, hoping to sow discord. Either way, Batista remained non-committal, and the meeting ended without any clear resolution. Little did Batista know, the man he had just met would become his most dangerous enemy, and the ultimate threat to the empire he and Lansky were trying to build. While Batista laid low, gangsterism raged on, shaping the volatile political landscape that would eventually catapult Castro to prominence. The seeds of rebellion were already sown, and Batista's plan to quietly bide his time before returning to power would soon face an unstoppable force in the form of Fidel Castro, who was preparing to change the course of Cuban history forever. In the early 1950s, Meyer Lansky was expanding his gambling empire in Cuba on a scale far larger than before the war. Lansky maintained close contact with his exiled friend, Fulgencio Batista, who was residing in Florida, and with Carlos Prio Socarrás, the Cuban president who had succeeded Ramón Grau San Martín in 1948. Prio, a Batista loyalist, also fell under Lansky's influence. A glimpse into the level of bribery at play was reflected in Prio's lavish mansion, built for $2,000, despite his official salary being only $25,000 per year. Lansky didn't mind the cost, but he firmly believed that Batista needed to return to Cuba and regain control to avoid the island falling into political and economic turmoil, which could jeopardize their gambling ventures. Acting as a discreet kingmaker, Lansky shuttled between Florida and Cuba, smoothing Batista's path back to power by greasing the palms of Cuban officials with considerable sums of money. Initially, Prio resisted the idea of Batista's return, but hefty deposits to his Swiss bank account shifted his stance. Eventually, Lansky's efforts bore fruit, and Batista made a triumphant return to Havana. American naval intelligence had a close eye on Lansky's role in Cuba's political landscape, and according to Doc Stacher, high-ranking government officials held lengthy discussions with Lansky, just as they had during World War II. Lansky was acutely aware of the pressure he was under, but he persistently advised Batista against repeating his earlier mistakes, particularly his previous dalliance with the Communist Party. Stacher once remarked, "Meyer was fiercely anti-communist, and always had been. The American government didn't need to push him in that direction." All the way up until his death, Lansky remained tight-lipped about the exact political role he played in Cuba, but it's clear that while Batista wanted to act sooner, Lansky urged caution. He recommended waiting until the 1952 elections. However, as the election neared, it became apparent that Batista's rivals were leading in the polls. Sensing impending trouble, Batista warned Lansky to stay off the island for a while, and on March 10, 1952, Batista made his move. With a small group of bodyguards and loyal followers, he seized control of Havana in a coup. The Cuban army, whose senior officers still remembered Batista's generosity from his previous rule, quickly rallied behind him. President Prio Socarrás offered no meaningful resistance, and with Batista firmly in power, Lansky set his grand plans into motion. Lansky's blueprint for Cuba was nothing short of visionary. Instead of merely opening small, thriving casinos, he envisioned opulent, sprawling hotel complexes that would rival those in Las Vegas, like the ones he and Bugsy Siegel had built. These hotels would offer world-class dining, top-tier entertainment, and luxury accommodations, creating an unrivaled gambling paradise. True to the maxim, "It's better to spend other people's money than your own," Lansky convinced Batista to have the Cuban government help finance the ambitious project. Batista, lured by promises of a substantial share of the profits, readily complied, pushing through legislation that facilitated Lansky's dream. The Cuban government agreed to match every dollar invested by foreigners, provided it was over $1 million, and granted coveted gambling licenses to these hotels. The fees for these licenses were minimal, and the casino hotels were exempt from Cuban taxes. Import duties on expensive materials were waived, and visas were issued to American personnel needed to run the casinos, who were also exempt from local taxes. Soon, Havana's coastline became a hub of frenzied construction as luxury hotels rose at an astonishing pace. But there was still unemployment on the island, Lansky told Uri Dan. "I decided to do something about it. I brought in Sammy Bratt, who worked for me in the United States, to set up a casino school at our Montmartre club in Havana. It was a working casino, but we trained hundreds of young Cubans to become skilled blackjack and roulette dealers, as well as other gaming operators. We also taught them the basics of hotel management. It was difficult because many of them were uneducated, and it would have been easier to bring in Americans, but I ran it as a social experiment." Lansky's old associates reaped the rewards of their loyalty. Men like Mo Dalitz, once part of the Cleveland Syndicate during the Prohibition era, were invited to invest in the burgeoning Cuban enterprise. However, when outsiders like Santos Traficante from Tampa, Florida, attempted to set up their own operations, they were rebuffed. Batista himself told Traficante, "You need approval from the little man before you can get a license on this island." Lansky's long-standing animosity towards Traficante stemmed from an earlier attempt by the latter to muscle into Lansky's territory in Miami. The tension between the syndicates, particularly between Meyer Lansky and the Traficante family, was managed by men like Russell Bufalino and Carlos Marcello. As Lansky's operations in Miami and Florida came under increased scrutiny, he needed more funds to invest overseas. Teaming up with Santo Trafficante, the Southern Mafia, and others aligned with his interests. However, the situation became complicated with Fulgencio Batista, who only dealt directly with Lansky. Trafficante, on the other hand, had ambitions of claiming Cuba as his own. Backed by the majority of the Italian Mafia, he knew that most of the money generated in Cuba was going through Lansky. Seeking to secure his own influence, Trafficante began supporting Fidel Castro by engaging in arms and weapons trafficking. He used men from Carlos Marcello's organization, as well as members of the Chicago outfit, to supply Castro with weapons. By 1960, when Castro's revolution gained momentum, every major mobster fled Cuba, including Russell Bufalino and Meyer Lansky. But one man, Santo Trafficante, remained behind. Believing his alliance with Castro was strong enough to protect him, Trafficante stayed, only to find himself arrested by Castro's forces. At this point, Trafficante realized his situation had changed dramatically. His decision to support Castro, which he thought would secure his position, backfired. Jack Ruby was reportedly sent to free him, but the damage was done. Trafficante's role in supporting Castro became a significant point of contention, putting his position in the world of organized crime on the line throughout the 1960s. Lansky entrusted his brother, Jacques Lansky, with the job of pit boss at the prestigious Hotel Nacional, overseeing operations and ensuring profits were accurately reported. Sam Tucker, an old friend who had managed the Beverly Hills Club, was appointed as the hotel's manager. Alongside their control of the National, Lansky and his associates held stakes in the Sevilla Biltmore and the Havana Hilton. For himself, Lansky financed the construction of the massive Riviera Hotel, costing $18 million. Despite putting up much of the money, Lansky's name never appeared on any official ownership documents. Meyer had a strange sense of humor, Doc Stacker once recalled. He rarely laughed, but one of the few jokes I ever heard him make was when he referred to himself as the kitchen manager of the Riviera. He even listed it on the payroll and reported it to the IRS as his primary source of income. We used to tease him about it, asking, "What's on the menu today, Cookie?" And he would smile a little. To keep things running smoothly, Lansky brought in seasoned professionals like Eddie Levinson, who had managed the Sands and Fremont casinos in Las Vegas, and Irving Nig Devine, who had operated casinos for Lansky in Miami Beach and Las Vegas. Herman Stark, another old friend from Lansky's early New York days, also joined the operation. Soon, charter flights brought high-stakes gamblers from across the United States to Havana, while Batista and his brother-in-law, Roberto Fernandez I. Miranda, continued to receive their share of the profits. The majority of Cubans saw little of the wealth that flooded into the country. Lansky had always wanted his children to experience a normal American upbringing, but his son Buddy happily followed in his father's footsteps, working in various roles across hotels in Florida, Nevada, and Cuba. Some of Lansky's associates were surprised to see his son holding relatively low-level positions like a switchboard operator. But those who knew better realized that running the switchboard at a major hotel was a job of considerable influence and importance in Lansky's world. At this moment in time, Meyer Lansky stood as an unrivaled powerhouse in the world of organized crime, with his influence extending well beyond the borders of the United States. His sharp intellect and strategic foresight had convinced numerous investors to pour vast sums of money into Havana, Cuba, transforming the island into a glittering hub of gambling and entertainment. Among those involved were prominent figures in organized crime, including Charlie "Lucky" Luciano, who held a stake in the prestigious Hotel Nacional alongside other powerful mobsters. The Trafficante crime family, notorious for its operations in Florida, also had interests in Havana's flourishing casino scene. What set Lansky apart, however, was not only his immense power, but also his reputation for honesty, integrity, and a steadfast refusal to engage in narcotics trafficking. Unlike many in his line of work, Lansky chose to focus on gambling, entertainment, and the hospitality industry. He spearheaded a wave of investment in casinos, hotels, and resorts in Cuba and beyond, all while maintaining a legitimate front. His operations were seen as clean, and this helped shield him from the kind of law enforcement scrutiny that plagued other mob bosses involved in more illicit ventures. This strategic shift came at a critical moment for the American Mafia. By the late 1940s, organized crime was increasingly under the microscope. Frank Costello, another powerful mob figure, made headlines when he appeared on the cover of Time magazine in November 1949, bringing national attention to his operations in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and Miami. Costello, a key figure in orchestrating alliances between Italian, Irish, and Jewish crime families, had played a crucial role in expanding the Mafia's influence across the US. But with this newfound spotlight came increased pressure from law enforcement and the media. The scrutiny on organized crime was escalating, especially around their involvement in gambling, which was both lucrative and highly controversial. The Mafia had initially broken new ground by persuading politicians, local communities, and even US senators that legalized gambling, particularly casinos, would bring prosperity and economic growth. This was especially true in Havana, where Lansky and his associates successfully convinced Cuban leaders that casinos would transform the island into a glamorous destination for wealthy tourists and gamblers. Once the financial potential became clear, local authorities and politicians began to cooperate, and the Mafia found themselves in an ideal position to exploit the booming casino business. However, success came with a price. As casinos became more lucrative, the very men who had orchestrated these operations, mob bosses and their trusted associates, became the subject of intense government scrutiny. The spotlight was now on their past criminal activities and their involvement in other illicit industries, from racketeering to narcotics. It was no longer possible to operate with the same degree of anonymity they once enjoyed. To counter this growing pressure, the Mafia bosses took steps to distance themselves from direct involvement in their casino enterprises. They appointed front men, legitimate businessmen or trusted allies to manage the day-to-day operations of their gambling establishments, while they continued to control everything from behind the scenes. By the 1950s, this shift in strategy became crucial for maintaining their influence over the casino industry without drawing too much attention. In Havana, Lansky's vision for casino-driven tourism was thriving. His influence extended beyond Cuba to places like Miami, where he and his associates continued to build a formidable gambling empire. The Mafia's operations weren't limited to Cuba and the United States, however. The Bahamas and other parts of the Caribbean soon became new frontiers for organized crime, offering similar opportunities for growth. In particular, the British, whose empire was in decline, began to look favorably upon the financial prospects that came with partnering with American mobsters. British-controlled territories, now seeking new sources of revenue, allowed Lansky and other mobsters to invest in building luxurious hotels, resorts, and casinos. In these overseas territories, organized crime played a critical role in stimulating local economies through massive investments in tourism infrastructure. With the Mafia's backing, these regions became popular destinations for high-stakes gamblers and wealthy tourists. The combination of relaxed gambling laws, political cooperation, and Lansky's keen business acumen allowed organized crime to operate casinos without much interference. However, as the 1950s came to a close, the challenges grew. The public was becoming increasingly aware of the Mafia's involvement in the casino industry, and authorities were beginning to crack down on the very same operations they had once turned a blind eye to. Organized crime, now a global force in the gambling world, had to constantly adapt to new pressures, whether from law enforcement, political shifts, or competition from rival mob families. Meyer Lansky's legacy in the world of gambling, particularly in Havana and Miami, was one of innovation, influence, and ruthless control. He had transformed Cuba into a gambling paradise, but his ability to stay ahead of law enforcement and avoid direct involvement in more nefarious criminal activities was what truly distinguished him. By positioning himself as a legitimate businessman and a master of strategic alliances, Lansky ensured that organized crime remained a powerful force in the casino world, both at home and abroad, long after his contemporaries had fallen under government scrutiny. Shortly before 1950, Meyer Lansky traveled to Italy to visit his old friend, Charlie Luciano. During their meeting, Lansky painted a vivid picture of the shifting landscape in America. He informed Luciano that Vito Genovese had been released and was now parading through his territories, acting as though he was already in charge. Genovese, ever ambitious, was bound to clash with Costello's men. Lansky also revealed that Genovese was quietly forging a partnership with Carlo Gambino. Both men were trying to keep their alliance under wraps, but it was only a matter of time before they made their move for total control. Luciano, no stranger to plotting and scheming, respected Gambino and was wary of Genovese's intentions. The last thing he wanted was for someone like Genovese to gain control of his family. He instructed Lansky to send a clear message to Gambino: "Keep your head down, don't rock the boat, and bide your time." Luciano even hinted that in 10 to 15 years he would fully support Gambino's rise to the top, but now was not the time. Lansky delivered the message, setting the stage for a stronger alliance between him and Gambino. Both men began to do more business together, growing closer as they realized the power of their combined influence. Gambino's network was further solidified through his strong ties with Tommy Lucchese, another man fiercely loyal to Luciano. Meanwhile, Lansky maintained tight connections with Mike Miranda, a key figure in the Genovese family. Lansky and Miranda's partnership stretched back to the days of Prohibition, with both men crisscrossing America to gather support for the Atlantic City Convention in 1929. Their shared history spanned at least 2 decades by the time the 1950s rolled around, and Miranda's deep respect for Lansky only strengthened Lansky's standing in New York's criminal underworld. Despite not being a formal boss, Lansky was seen as a ruler of the Jewish Mafia, commanding the respect of major figures like Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo in Chicago. Lansky's influence extended far beyond New York. In Chicago, he opened the doors for the outfit to invest in Las Vegas gambling operations, welcoming them into Havana, Cuba as well. Al Capone had been a close friend, so Lansky's position in Chicago was solid. He also allied with the Cuban Mafia and the Corsican Mafia in Havana, allowing them to operate in the casino business and securing Batista's backing. Luciano himself acknowledged that Lansky would never cross or disrespect the Trafficantes, as they were business partners in Miami, Havana, and beyond. Carlos Marcello, the powerful New Orleans boss, respected Lansky through his ties with Costello, Castel, and Luciano. Lansky's reach wasn't limited to organized crime. He teamed up with Russell Bufalino to secure Havana's lucrative casino operations, receiving muscle and financial backing from the Teamsters. Meanwhile, Lansky allowed the Chicago outfit and New Orleans families to partner with Jewish mobsters like Phil Castle, further intertwining organized crime with international ventures. As Lansky's empire grew, he began using New Orleans as a hub for communications with the Corsican and Cuban mafias, forging a vast criminal enterprise that spanned across the US and the world. By the late 1940s, Lansky opened his first bank account in Switzerland, not just for himself, but for Batista and other powerful politicians. During the 1950s, Red Levine played a key role in communicating between Luciano, Lansky, and their organization. As Levine expanded his operations into Miami, Florida, he began taking control of various gambling enterprises, working closely with Meyer Lansky and members of his outfit, including Nick Rosen. His influence and connections ran deep, particularly with Russell Bufalino. In fact, whenever Bufalino or the Buffalo Mob, including Stefano Magaddino, needed to send a message to Charlie Lucky Luciano, they knew they could trust Red Levine to deliver it. The bond between Levine